Welcome, everyone. My name is Francisco Bando, and I work as Policy and Program Manager for the Peak Urban Program at the University of Oxford, and I'm going to be introducing to you today's session. If you're here, it's likely because you believe that it's important that communities give input into city building, that community voices inform resilience-enhancing infrastructure. You might agree that in giving that input, communities exercise agency, they develop capacity, and two things happen. They become more resilient, and the built infrastructure that they contribute towards, their built environment, also becomes more resilient. So a positive cycle. One of the ways that communities give input into city building is in collaboration with local governments. And so to set the scene, we've invited the mayor of Itagüí, Fernando Escobar, to give you an address and to let you know from his perspective how climate change is affecting his municipality as well as his plans for a resilient Itagüí. So the video from Fernando Escobar, please.
Soy José Fernando Escobar, alcalde de la ciudad de Itagüí, Colombia. Quiero connotar un poco nuestra ciudad. Tenemos 19.35 kilómetros cuadrados, 290.000 habitantes. Somos el segundo municipio más pequeño de Colombia y el más densamente poblado. Tenemos 13.500 unidades productivas. Somos la ciudad no capital empresarial de Colombia. Tenemos entonces una alta densidad, espacios públicos limitados. Venimos trabajando de acuerdo a la Ley 388 del 98, que regula el plan de ordenamiento territorial, las diferentes áreas de cómo ser una ciudad ambientalmente sostenible. Los tiempos de concentración de agua se han venido disminuyendo, no solamente en Itagüí, sino en toda la connotación de los 10 municipios del área metropolitana. Somos parte de un área metropolitana donde tenemos una autoridad ambiental en lo urbano y en lo rural, trabajando con diferentes áreas. Por eso esta alcaldía ha venido fortaleciendo también y en los procesos anteriores lo que es el plan de gestión del riesgo y el plan de atención y cambio climático. Unos temas importantes porque tenemos que ser ciudades resilientes. Por eso en obras de infraestructura venimos canalizando las diferentes quebradas, trabajando también con componentes arbóreos. Aquí estamos en el parque principal de nuestra ciudad. Combinamos los diferentes andenes, pero también con lo que tiene que ver con nuestra naturaleza. Tenemos un sector protegido en nuestra ciudad, un DMI, donde conservamos, pagamos por servicios ambientales. Tenemos 11 acueductos veredales. Seguir fortaleciendo el tema ambiental en nuestra ciudad es muy importante. La siembra de árboles, la conciencia social, es otro de los temas que venimos trabajando desde una de nuestras áreas, que es la Secretaría de Medio Ambiente. El otro tema importante es el reciclaje en nuestra ciudad. Producimos una gran cantidad de toneladas y estamos invitando a la comunidad al plan Recicla, Itagüí Recicla. Y por eso ya lo hemos hecho en 3 de las 6 comunas y el corregimiento. Por eso venimos trabajando, fortaleciendo, concientizando a nuestra comunidad. Itagüí es una ciudad resiliente, tenemos una quebrada importante, la segunda después del río Medellín, que es la quebrada Doña María, sobre la cual respetamos los retiros y fortalecemos en siembra de árboles y mitigación del riesgo. Diferentes áreas, programas, proyectos. Itagüí entonces es una ciudad ambientalmente sostenible y esa es nuestra meta al año 2040 en la revisión y ajuste del plan de ordenamiento territorial y en lo que estamos planteando con el área metropolitana y con el departamento de Antioquia en una Antioquia 2040. A eso le estamos apuntando en la ciudad de Itagüí, con diferentes áreas, programas, proyectos en temas ambientales y ser una ciudad resiliente.
You've just heard from the mayor of Itagüí on his vision for a resilient Itagüí. You've heard about his plans to address increasingly common landslides, to protect the environment, including through planting trees and recycling, promoting recycling, as well as other relevant plans. And later, you'll hear about how the community influences or is involved in the decision-making in Itagüí. Mayors like Fernando across the world are working to build more resilient cities. And you might be asking yourself, to what extent will they be able to achieve those plans? Or will those plans, even if they're achieved, be enough to avert a climate disaster? You might be asking yourself if they have all of the right information or if they have the correct approach. Change is a constant force, both in nature and in society. And today at COP26 on Cities Day, we come together because we're aware that we need to redirect course and accelerate the pace of change. Weary, of course, that in the past, accelerated change has led to sometimes even disastrous unintended consequences. So we approach this moment, Code Red for Humanity, do or die, act now, with a resolve for action that includes careful consideration for the implications of those actions and utmost humility. Today, you're going to hear from a series of speakers from the University of Oxford, from Google. You're going to hear from World Resources Institute and other institutions. And these speakers are going to give you examples of case studies that highlight how to rebuild and build, how to invent and reinvent infrastructure that enhances resilience. And those case studies are going to be organized to demonstrate an approach that's going to do two things. The first thing that the approach does is it informs and guides our it guides our ambition to choose the right infrastructure, as well as it injects a level of humility and a renewed awareness of the magnitude of the task. The approach is called Peak Urban. PEAK is an acronym, P-E-A-K. You'll hear about the acronym throughout the course of today's session. And what I will say about the PEAK approach is that it's a way of addressing, of affecting change in the way that you intend it, in minimizing unintended consequences. So without further ado, today's panel, there's going to be three panels. The first panel is going to speak to the P of the acronym, the second to the E and the A of the acronym, and the third to the K. And to introduce the first panel, we have Susan Parnell. Susan is a research professor at the University of Bristol. She is emeritus professor at the African Center for Cities of the University of Cape Town, and she is deputy director of the Peak Urban program. Sue, what is the P in the Peak Urban approach?
Thanks, Francisco, and very good to have everybody here, wherever you are in the world. As Francisco said, the P, E, A, and the K are elements of what we think of as, you can think of it as a framework, you can think of it as a disposition, you can think of it as an approach, but it's a set of ideas about how we may work collectively more effectively in order to address the changes that we need in cities. And so the P, which stands for prediction, is really a way of saying, what do we know and what do we need to know? And how do we gather the knowledge that we have, the observations that we have about cities? How do we use the knowledge that comes from different disciplines, from anthropologists, from geographers, from engineers, from medics, from big data? How do we ensure the integrity methodologically of each of those contributions and ensure that we bring those different elements together to these very complex urban problems that we have got before us? Because we know if we're going to have to make change, we're going to have to make it at scale. And so in this session in panel one, we've got two speakers. The first is Nidia Sarijian, who is going to we're particularly excited about this because in a way it exemplifies what the peak is. She's the technical leader, currently serving as the director of global solutions for Google Earth and the Earth Engine. And it's her team that is responsible for bringing geospatial data and insights across a whole range of different domains of climate action, air quality, biodiversity, habitat conservation, health, together. And so I think without further ado, let's go straight to you to introduce us to the Environmental Insights Explorer. Can I hand over to you? Lydia.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sue. I'm really excited to be here and to be speaking at Peak. Are we going to cue the slides? Great. Okay. So hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be joining in this evening's discussion on data and the great ecosystem that we have to work with, even as Google, to really impact climate action. So when we think about Google, obviously everybody knows about Google Earth Engine. But at Google, we are building technology that goes beyond search. And we are looking at technology that helps people and helps the planet. We started this because this is a founding value at Google. Google has been carbon neutral since 2007, but we also know, quite humbly, that our job is more than to make ourselves carbon neutral. It is to make sure that our technology can have true impact on people and the planet. Next slide. So with that, what we decided to do was to really take a keen look at carbon emissions and then really ask ourselves and our stakeholders, what are the biggest problems that we are facing today? And in that, we spoke to cities. Unsurprisingly, cities are where more than 50% of the world's population lives. And more than that, there's going to be many, many millions, billions more that will migrate to cities in the coming decade. So cities are great for economic opportunity and jobs and just basic progress, but they're also the place with very heavy emissions. And emissions lead to other quality of life issues, such as disasters, as well as health issues like air quality. So I work in the Google Maps organization, and if you can imagine the same data that takes you from point A to point B on a map, including with aerial overhead imagery data and some third-party data sets, we are able to really come in and calculate emissions data for cities. So cities really told us that what they're missing is basic emissions data. It takes a long time to collect, it's costly, and they're missing the expertise and the resources. And our goal is to take that pain away, is to really democratize that data so that every city has access and can jump to the much more interesting and critical part of the journey, which is planning what they're going to do, which I'll talk about in a second on the next slide. So that brings me to introducing our main product, and it's called Environmental Insights Explorer. And that's at insights.sustainability.google.com. And our goal is to, at scale, provide trustworthy, timely, and insights so that mayors, but city officials, data analysts, any NGOs that are advising them can take impactful decisions much, much faster. Go to the next slide. So let me give you a sense for the goal that we have set for ourselves. You're at COP26, and you've heard a lot of 2030 goals. And we've set a similar one for ourselves. Knowing that cities own many, many of the gigatons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we've set a goal for ourselves to try and help at least 500 cities or local governments to reduce at least 1 gigaton per year of carbon by 2030. This is not a small ask, especially because we don't control everything. We don't control what happens on the ground. We rely on the ecosystem. We rely on cities passing policies and making things happen. But the thing that we do control is getting this data, this insight in the hands of the right people. So let's take a look at those insights. Next slide. So essentially, this is the journey that a city typically goes through. They measure what are their baseline insights or emissions. What are my building emissions? What are my transportation emissions? Even within building emissions, is it from commercial? Is it residential, etc.? Then they go to planning. Okay, should I be really focusing on transport? Should I put in bike lanes? Should I put in a subsidy for electric vehicles, etc., etc.? And then you're really going into acting. What are the shovel-ready projects? How do I need to finance this, and how do I track it? So when we think about EIE, our sweet spot has really been in this planning phase. Can we get really quickly to the scenarios that cities can look at and start making decisions faster so they can jump to the act phase? So let me show you some of the insights that we have in EIE. The first one is building emissions. So this is a snapshot. As I said, we use overhead imagery. We get a sense for the height of the building, the size, the square footage, the building type, and then we are able to use those to calculate building intensity. And not only that, we know that every city will probably have their own assumptions. So we make sure that you can come in, you can put in your own assumptions and tweak that data a little bit. So this is building emissions. Secondly, if you go to the next slide, we also pride ourselves on having really great and trustworthy transport emissions. We take highly complicated, aggregated, but anonymized insights to analyze local trips and modal trends within and outside a city. And we are refreshing this activity data year over year. I can't tell you the number of cities that have told us that they haven't done a transportation emission inventory in 5 years, maybe even 10 years. So your ability to say, oh, I put in bike lanes or I made public transport better, are my emissions and my trips coming down? That is what we are aiming to provide in EIE. In addition to transport, before we go to others, I want to talk about, since we're talking about transport, a great example, which is the city of Dublin. Dublin is, to their credit, a very progressive city when it comes to really thinking about urban mobility. And they were already on this path to really thinking about how do we make the city more friendly outside of just for those that drive. So they used EIE data, went really deep on their transportation emissions, and they sought to take bike trips across the city up by 20% by 2025. Now that was the goal that they set before COVID, and you can all guess what happened. So much of travel left cars and went into bikes and other types of modes, and that is something that's really jump-started Dublin's path into using biking as a very critical mode for their citizens. If you go next, I can talk to you a little bit about energy offsetting through solar. The same overhead imagery that I talked to you before can look at buildings and roof data and give you the solar potential of a city. I have a great example on the next slide from the mayor of Edmonton in Canada. And Canada is far north, but they get enough sunshine in the summer, and they were able to make solar a very viable, affordable option for their homeowners. On the next slide, you'll see that we are using that same drone data to look at tree canopy. And in fact, the mayor of LA and the city of LA have decided to use this to see which low-income neighborhoods can they go and plant trees in. So on the next slide, which is, I believe, my last slide, you saw some great examples, you saw some case studies. You might also be thinking these are all leader cities. Not all of them. We are getting great examples across Latin America, Asia, where cities are taking EIE data and beginning to create inventories and plans. And we're excited that we are going to have EIE. We already have it in more than 3,000 cities. It's going to be in 20,000 cities in the year to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Colleagues, just a wonderful example of the kinds of innovation that are at the cutting edge of our thinking in the P, this prediction domain. It gives me an enormous pleasure to introduce you now to my colleague and co-collaborator in PEAK, Professor Juan Carlos Duque, who is from the University of Yafet in Colombia. And he is the founding director there of the RISE group, which is research in spatial economics. And Juan's work, which he'll give us a taste of, is exactly the sort of stuff he's widely involved in work in what I would call the sort of the P area, the prediction area, whether it's for the World Bank, for UN Habitat, the European Commission, local authorities and economic development agencies. But Juan, can we give you over to you and talk us through how your work fits into the P, the prediction of peak?
Thank you, Sue. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here. Just 1 second. Okay, perfect. Can you see my screen now?
We have you. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Susan, thank you so much for having me join you virtually from Colombia. I would like to start my presentation with this short sentence, short phrase from the first law of geography. In space, everything is related to everything else. This is a short phrase, but with profound implications. According to this law, a problem that starts, for example, in this part of the world is going to generate other problems in other places, which at the same time are going to generate other problems and so on. And all these effects generate intricate relationships between, not only between places, but also between problems. And this is why we can claim that the problems we face in our societies are global and complex. This is not just a nice sentence to say in COP26. There are some laws underneath that make it real. And this is also why we as humanity face global challenges. Although we have some problems more localized than others, we don't have a version of the SDGs for the global north and a way different version of SDGs for the global south. We have a common set of SDGs, and we have a common set of global challenges. And those global challenges require integral solutions. And this is why the University of Oxford, in collaboration with Peking University, the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, the African Center for Cities, and EAFIT University, developed the PIG framework. And this framework allows us to see the problems from different perspectives, and also to have the global north and the global south working together to have a better understanding, a more integral understanding, a complementary understanding of the problems we are facing. And also it allows us to see the problems from the lenses of multidisciplinarity. And when you approach a problem from different angles, from different cultures, from different disciplines, you will be able to generate innovative solutions. And those solutions can translate not only into academic publications, but also into new opportunities to contribute to policy design. So I'm gonna show you a little bit how we do things in RISE. First of all, we constantly explore new forms of data. That data allow us to work in conditions of data scarcity, and also allow us to guarantee replicability and scalability and lower cost. And then we use a wide range of methods to better explore the complex relationship, spatiotemporal relationship between urban systems. And then we use that data and those methods to have some ideas about how to face how cities can challenge fast urban growth, and also generate ideas about how to make already built cities more sustainable, and also to propose new ways for inclusive economic growth. I'm gonna show you very quickly some examples about how we apply this methodology. In this case, we explore how some different dimensions of urban growth can help cities to be more productive. We did that for all Latin American cities in collaboration with the World Bank. In this case, we found an association between the accessibility to green spaces and the reduction of risk of cardiovascular diseases. Note how we start generating those connections between urban systems. No? This solution, for example, or these results are a good excuse for having a coffee between the Secretary of Health in Medellin and the Secretary of Urban Planning, for example. And that also gives us good ideas for our universities to, for example, prepare future generations to be ready for this type of interactions. We can have, for example, homeworks in our programs that encourage or motivate our students to to collaborate between programs. No, the people from mathematical engineering collaborating with people from economics, computer science with political science. This is the way we can contribute to prepare future policymakers to be able to interact to each other. In this case, we found how built environment can help us to better predict cycling distance. And then we can use that prediction to design more efficient and better cycling paths within our cities. Or we can use Google Street View imagery to automatically detect buildings' structural typology, which is a key element in exposure models for seismic risk assessment. Or we can use the same type of images to have a better idea about how commercial activities are distributed within our highly informal cities. Or finally, we can use freely available satellite imagery for prediction of city growth. So I would like to end this presentation with a statement from this very energetic research group from the Global South. I'm going to read it. These findings are possible thanks to international and inclusive research funds intended to support new solutions to challenges faced by a global and complex network of cities. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Juan. And if you could take down that screen. Colleagues, we are in a new world where we have both a virtual audience and we have a real audience. We do have just a few minutes for some questions. You can use the chat function if you are in the virtual space, and if there's anybody in Glasgow who would like to indicate a question, if you could let us know. There are already some questions from the virtual. So Francisco, can you see if there's anybody sticking up their hand, or should we move straight to the questions that I've got here from colleagues on the chat?
You can take the online questions, Sue.
That's great. Okay. So Francisco, the first Juan, the first question is actually for you, and it says you've spoken about north-south divides and the importance of international collaborations, but you also spoke about lots of different disciplines, and it's very clear from your presentation that you also use very different platforms. Which of those tensions is the question, is the most difficult to navigate? The north-south, the different disciplines, or the different platforms?
Thank you for that question, Sue. Definitely based on our experience, it has been the interaction between disciplines. You know, global north and global south, like we have been working together and everything has worked very well. But at the beginning, for example, in our group, when we started to interact to other disciplines, it was like being in the Babel Tower, different languages, different way to see the problems. And at the beginning, it was very challenging to start that communication between disciplines. And it was a beautiful process in which the people from mathematics start teaching some key elements to social science, and that conversation start taking place in a natural way. Once we closed that barrier, everything was so perfect for us. So I would say like the barrier between disciplines was the most challenging, but the experience from which we learned a lot.
That's really interesting. And the other question is, in fact, for Francia. This question is it's a positive question and an excited question. It says, who can have access to the data from your tool? What does it cost, and how do we get it?
Yeah, happy to answer that. So the good news is that this data is free and it's open to access. We are, however, city-facing. So we know that this data is aggregated to the city level, to the local government level. So you can go into insights.sustainability.google.com, and there's a small form that anybody who works for a city or is affiliated with a city that needs to fill out, and they can once they're in there, they can get access. The whole point of this is to democratize it. So our goal is not to make it hard for cities to access their data. The other thing that I did not get to talk about too much in my presentation, given time, but I mentioned at the beginning, is that we are very aware that, we didn't just come in and start creating climate data for the first time as Google. There's a whole ecosystem out there. So we work with third-party partners like Global Covenant of Mayors. We work with ICLEI. I'm sure each region has their own partners, whether they're NGOs or affiliated with universities or for-profit consultants. Our goal is to make sure that cities can go to where the platforms they use for climate action and get their data there. So I would say two things. You can go directly to our site and sign up, and or if you have a city network or a partner that you belong to or you're a member of, it's very likely that we already work with them, and you can get not just data, but you can get a webinar, you can get training, and you can get much more hands-on onboarding onto EIE.
Great. Thank you so much. And the historian in me says, and I really hope that this is all being appropriately archived so that we can get really long-term trends, not just future-facing, but also retrospectively. And that really speaks to the next panel that we're going to go into, which is going to move into the other elements of our peak framework or disposition, things that we think it's helpful to take into account when you try to work together to address these mega challenges associated with cities and climate change. And it's with that that I want to hand over to Professor Michael Keith, who is the director and the principal investigator of the PEAK program. Michael, in Glasgow, I believe, not in Oxford, but with no mic on.
Thanks,
See,
Sue.
it's not just an online problem.
Thanks, Sue, and thanks for that fantastic first panel from colleagues. As we move on, we know that cities are never finished. Cities are the exciting places. They're where newness comes into the world. What that means, that's newness of ideas, it's newness of practices, it's economic, it's cultural. It brings the cultural and the material together. It brings together infrastructure with the way infrastructure is used. When we're thinking about how that is used, we have to understand the city as a site of emergence. Emergence is the term that gives us the letter E, the second of the four letters of our acronym. And today we're going to hear a bit more in this session about what that emergence might mean in contexts where communities are leading or very engaged in new forms of emergence in cities across the world in the face of climate change and the crisis. We also, though, know that those kinds of combination, those kinds of novelty, bring together different kinds of knowledge. If you're going to create a new city, it is created in somebody's image, in the image of certain kinds of practice. We know the car has been the driver of too many cities. We also know that certain kinds of financial interests have shaped cities for the majority to be less privileged than a privileged minority. What that means is we need to ask ourselves in whose image the city is being remade and which knowledges are being deployed, which practices are being adopted. A term that gives us the A for adoption, the A of the acronym. And in particular, when we're thinking of adoption, we need to think about how we try and bring together different kinds of knowledge and different kinds of interest, and how we actually make them commensurable or face the fact that it is sometimes incommensurable when you make the city in the image of an engineer as opposed to the image of a neoclassical economist or the wishes of people locally. We need to think through those tensions and trade-offs as cities emerge, which is why we've got a couple of fantastic presentations coming up from colleagues who have thought through some of these issues, but in a very practical context, deployed them when we're thinking about what it means to think about community engagement and resilience in the face of new infrastructures that confront us in areas of informality and residential uncertainty and precarity, but also in areas which are fundamentally lacking in the basic service provision, services like sanitation, which is why we have two presentations. The first from Robin King, the Director of Knowledge Capture and Collaboration at the World Resources Institute, our partner on the panels today. And then secondly, from Shoaib Louassa, the researcher from the Global Center on Adaptation. And the first of our presenters in this panel is from Robin. Robin King is the Director of Knowledge Capture and Collaboration at the WRI Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. And in this role, she promotes collaboration across WRI's international network to better integrate urban planning, land use, and sustainable transportation, using her experience working in policy matters in the Americas and Asia. Robin, over to you.
Thank you very much. Before I start speaking, we're going to show a short video. So there's a video on informal settlement upgrading. If you could play that, please.
As urbanization accelerates, unplanned growth is leading to disconnected neighborhoods without basic infrastructure and high environmental costs. Expanding access to services with flexible planning standards can foster affordable, livable density. Integrated planning while upgrading most informal settlements in place is key. Creating shared water taps and toilet blocks and adjusting laws for plot sizes and using vacant land can provide quick wins for households and communities. Reliable public transport, safer streets for walking and cycling, and clean energy access can unlock opportunities. Done with climate risks in mind, these changes can drastically improve living conditions and economic and environmental outcomes for all.
Great. And thank you very much. And now we've got, great. So I first would like to thank you for allowing us to share some of our findings on this panel. Our World Resources Report includes 16 papers that include a framing paper that was released and launched in Quito at Habitat 3, a synthesis paper called 7 Transformations for More Equitable and Sustainable Cities that was launched a couple of weeks ago. 7 thematic papers, of which one was on housing, and 7 case studies, one of which is on kampung improvement programs in Surabaya that I'll speak about. And then one was actually done by Shoaib on Kampala. And so he'll speak about that one sort of next. I'll talk mainly about our Surabaya case, but before I do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the framework that we use at WRR, which actually fits in very nicely with the PEAK framework. And we will be talking mainly about issues sort of on the E side in terms of emerging as well as in adoption. But before that, sort of just the problem that we're dealing with in the world, especially in the global south, is really thinking about the urban services divide and this big difference between those who are underserved and those who are well served. And you can see on the line below, we represent the underserved who have very uneven and perhaps no or poor access to water, sanitation, energy, transport, and decent housing, which we focus on as our key services. And the difference between folks that are better served, that have reliable, affordable, secure, and safe access to these same kinds of services. And one of the things that we know is that housing, when we talk about housing, it's shelter, but it's also the place where a lot of these services get accessed, right? And where people sort of come together to live, and to live with dignity requires sort of access to some of these kinds of services. So next, please. So I want to talk briefly about Surabaya's inclusive approach to Indonesia's urban housing problem in the Kampung Improvement Program, which innovated and sustained in situ upgrading policies from 1969 to 2008. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is that the program changed over time and it learned and it evolved as it got different kinds of resources and different kinds of knowledge that built up over time, which I think is also an important part of sort of the peak approach to things. These community managed efforts brought basic infrastructure services to the kampung and provided affordable housing and livelihood opportunities for the poor in a very inclusive kind of way. This was not a program that was imposed from on top, but it was something that the community themselves and residents worked as part of in formulating the problem and coming up with solutions and then in implementing them. And when we, in the case studies that we do, we try to tell the story of what happened, both in terms of sort of progress forward as well as setbacks, because we know there are always going to be obstacles and setbacks, but then try to analyze what some of the key enabling conditions are. And in this case, among the key emerging or enabling conditions are Surbaya's pro-poor leadership that was willing to listen to the poor, the city government's collaboration with local universities, that allowed them to develop for students to gather experience in the kampong, as well as some of the students to later go on to become mayor and to take on very important roles within the city. And then perhaps most importantly, establishing trust with the citizens, that somehow the university, the residents, and the government were able to work together to help make KIP and then later settlement upgrading programs possible. Next, please. So what I'll do now is talk about the 7 transformations that we talk about in our paper on 7 transformations for more equitable and sustainable cities. And these fall into 3 buckets. Those buckets are reimagining service provision, including the excluded, and enabling change. And in each of these, I'll talk about the individual transformations and then how they apply in the case of Surbaya and kampong upgrading. In terms of the reimagining service provision, we're talking about infrastructure design and delivery and really wanting to change to prioritize the vulnerable and to think about alternative service provision models so that the city can partner with alternative service providers and think more creatively about how to provide services. So in the case of Surbaya, what we see is really on the first infrastructure design and delivery, we see a more integrated and holistic approach about thinking about the kampong as a place and as for the delivery of services there, so that we can incorporate improved infrastructure design into a neighborhood that is sort of traditional and traditionally has more vulnerable and poor people. In terms of including the excluded, we try to talk about, we talk about data collection practices and emphasize the importance of improving local data through community engagement, as well as acknowledging informal urban employment, recognizing and supporting urban informal workers that often are invisible and that often sort of face problems working against them instead of saying, okay, these folks can be part of the solution. In the case of Surbaya and kampong upgrading, the university worked with residents of the community along with students, so there were both professors and students from the university, to gather granular data that helped identify specific kampong needs and then that helped make that sort of their needs more visible and more convincing to folks at different levels of government, sort of whether it's sort of the city, sort of the nation, and then internationally with institutions like the World Bank to get more access to increased funding, which gets into the enabling change bucket of financing and subsidies, urban land management, and governance and institutions. On financing and subsidies, we talk about increasing investment as well as targeting the funds that are spent more effectively, innovatively, and towards the vulnerable. On urban land management, we talk about promoting transparency and integrated spatial planning. And on Transformation 7, with governance and institutions, we talk about creating diverse coalitions and aligning the different actors together so that they're working and moving in the same direction instead of fighting against each other. In the case of Surbaya and financing and subsidies, we see increased funds that are going to the kampong. That increased funding started at the community level and with local funds, and then there were more national funds and eventually World Bank funds that came and allowed them to continue and evolve and improve. Then on the urban land management transformation, we talked about integrated planning itself, bringing those services along together with land planning, regularizing tenure, maintaining traditional neighborhoods and traditional culture and livelihoods. That is very, very important, as well as this sort of broader planning that brought together folks that didn't often talk to each other before to connect land, housing, and other services. And then finally, in terms of creating diverse coalitions and alignment, we have local government, and that local success helped drive national policy. And that required an effort across city departments between the city and communities and the university. The leadership in the local university really, really helped. And I think probably most importantly, that the city authorities worked with local groups and residents who contributed sweat equity, their own funds, but most importantly, knowledge and expertise and their desire to help shape their community. So next, please. I could go on for hours and hours about this. We have lots and lots of papers. And if you're interested in more details, at citiesforall.org, you can find more. So I hope that you end up coming to hear more about what we've done, as well as all of the researchers that are speaking today. Thank you.
Many thanks, Robin. We're going to move straight on to our next speaker, Shoaib. Shoaib Lawasa is a principal researcher on adaptation, governance, and transformation at the Global Center on Adaptation. He's worked extensively on interdisciplinary research projects focused on African cities and in South Africa in particular. But in terms of today's talk, people will be particularly interested. He's the lead author for the IPCC special report on land and climate change. So, Shoaib, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Pleasure to be here as well. And what a nice panel. Great to see some of the old friends. My presentation today is going to zoom in a little bit on the work that we did in partnership with WRI on the citation. But rather than going into the details of what the findings are, my presentation is going to really talk about the summary of key highlights of the big lessons that we are learning through collaborations that are emerging in cities like the case of Kampala and Surabaya and others around sanitation, that are actually the signals of initial steps for inclusive, resilient, and sustainable cities in African context. So next slide. A couple of issues have been raised and mentioned by previous speakers. I feel that the peak framework very much, or this particular case study, aligns very much with the peak framework from the P, E, and A in all of them. And I will talk about the P later, maybe, but the A and the E and A, emergence and adoption, very much aligns with the issues of sanitation problems being a conundrum in many African cities, with majority, the gap that has been illustrated on a very nice illustration there. And part of the problem is that the model for infrastructure, sanitation infrastructure in many cities has been largely driven by public and private sector. And that means centralized, highly networked systems that seem to be, from our findings, far, far behind from what the underserviced are doing. So the underserviced, yes, are underserviced if we use the lenses of the private and public sector-led sanitation infrastructure, but they are also in the lead in building resilience through some of the illustrations that I'm going to show here as emerged from our study. And their lead is in respect to ingenuity response to inadequacy, where there is a development of a mix of sanitation solutions. It can also work with water and other infrastructure, which are coupled with a business model that actually is good for micro, small, and medium enterprises, as I'll also illustrate. And it's very flexible, adaptable, as well as possibilities for connecting it to the centralized systems to make some kind of hybrid sanitation infrastructure systems. So again, it's not a replacement of the centralized systems, but rather a complement, and inherently it's building resilience where the communities and different people are offering more than just voices. So again, it's people-centered, that characteristic, but it's just more than voices. They are actually in the lead, in the co-design, in the co-implementation of these sanitation solutions. Next slide. And the next slide actually shows a couple of different sanitation configurations that we have observed and worked with from a R&D perspective when I was at Makerere University in Kampala, where you have multiple benefits from these different type of sanitation infrastructure solutions and configurations. Those their benefits include increasing a little bit better with decency sanitation solutions in terms of coverage, affordability, accessibility, but also contributing to mitigation of climate change and creating opportunities. So there is, for example, the biotoilet technology, which is good for institutions and schools that we discovered in Kampala, designed and built in collaboration with the community schools and KCCA, which is the municipal authority. There's also other on-site type of technologies which are represented in low income, very low income, medium income, and even high income that are not planned in the cities. And there are also other technologies that have developed around the existing pit latrine system for emptying it, with collaboration with civil society organizations like Water for People, the Transfer Tank here, and the Galpa community boys or Galpa SMEs, and then linking to the centralized system. So it's a very interesting kind of business model-oriented sanitation solution where the existing pit latrines are emptied, and then there is a transfer tank that is stationed in the community that is managed by a civil society organization. Of course, the local leaders are part of the whole, because there is even a toll-free call-in. If it's full, then it is taken to the central sewer treatment plant. So it's an interesting emerging solution that is increasing coverage, affordability, and accessibility. Going on to the next slide, here are the big kind of thoughts that emerged from the findings on this case study, where the collaboration between civil society, communities, Kampala Capital City Authority, and the academia, where we're coming from, and WRI, is actually enabling a reclaiming of legitimacy of the public sector, particularly the municipality, in the sense that the legitimacy of the Kampala Capital City Authority is very much now less derived from the legal perspective, but rather accountability, responsibility, and the moral obligation that everyone in the city has the right to access basic services such as sanitation. So the model that is based on multiple technologies is very good and seems to be very promising. The investments required are less, and the replacement and maintenance costs are also quite limited. There is a regulation and a set of ordinances that have been developed in Kampala to allow a redesign of the pit latrine model to become emptyable, cleanable, and reusable, because the current technology is once the pit latrine is full, then they have to find some other space to dig another hole. But with this new one, alongside with the design, which is very much led by Kampala Capital City Authority and tested by the communities, is a set of new skills sets that have been developed for the masons who will be building, and they have already started building some of these technologies to allow a range of options that actually cater for all the different income groups, from the very low income communities to a medium that may not be connected or close to a sanitation facility. So this is affordable, as well as the important highlight from the findings is that the informal is the city. So perhaps that is a prediction, the P. So we can predict that the informal is not going to go away, even when there's been a lot of programs for informal upgrading and clearance and all that. It's not going to go away in the short run, and therefore there has to be a rethinking about urban infrastructure in the design, the technologies, but also how to govern that. A lot of these good, potentially promising solutions also need to be guided, if not regulated, but in a way that is different from perhaps the centralized network systems. And the figure on the left is coming from the case study paper that was published as part of the case study that illustrates where the gaps are. So a lot of actors on the left here that are involved in decision making, which is the imagination of the cities, in whose image the city is built. It is the public authorities, the private sector, and other people who may might be, who might eventually take control of the utility and facilities within the city and less to the communities. In the same way, not much in terms of funding goes into these alternative technologies. So there has to be a rethinking of the financial model for urban infrastructure and development. And that would also bring in or enhance participation from simply, providing information or, piloting, but being in the lead and the co-design of some of these solutions that are very important in enabling transformation. And my last slide, which is the next one, simply highlights a few things. I'm not going to explain the detail, but this is just an illustration of possible pathways of enabling this transformation of multiple technologies for sanitation, where the elevation of the elevation of the voices of the communities can go beyond just voices to include, participation and the co-design, opportunities creation to transform the, infrastructure within the cities, as well as improve.
Shoaib, if you can begin to move to a close, if you're sorry to hurry, we're on very tight timelines. But
no problem. That was the last. Thank you so much. So I just wanted to highlight the colored boxes. Thank you. Back to you, Mike.
Shoaib, thank you very much, and thank you both for those great presentations. We're trying to squeeze some questions in. We've got a couple actually for the presenters. If we get a chance, we'll come back to after the final session, because we're overrunning just slightly. So I just want to move on to the fourth of the four-letter acronym that we have been working with today, which emerges from some of the things that we've already heard. We've just heard about the importance of pro-poor city government working alongside researchers, working alongside community voice. And in a sense, what that exemplifies is how we think about recognizing the particular situations of cities across the world alongside the different voices that need to be heard in order to make a difference. And what we're moving on to in the final section today, on the final panel, is a series of a couple of presentations on knowledge exchange. And we've got one example from the Peak Urban program, and one example as well from our colleague Charlene Kouassi. And in each of these, I guess what we're trying to say in terms of bringing the different contributors together today is that when we are recognizing lessons across the world, we face universal challenges, but they land very differently in different parts of the world. So a form of knowledge exchange depends on bringing together the different sources of knowledge, sometimes rooted in the private sector, sometimes in research laboratories, in the urban sciences, but also rooted in progressive forms of city government alongside engagement with people on the ground. And those kinds of partnership are exemplified in the presentations we're going to hear more from. And the first of these is from Charlene. Charlene Kouassi is based in Abidjan, and she specializes in African mobility and transport trends. She's the director of the African Mobilities Observatory, and she's been working with the Climate Change Association on the creation of a roadmap for sustainable mobility in Côte d'Ivoire. Charlene, many thanks for coming, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share with you this collaborative process that we have led in Côte d'Ivoire for the last 2.5 years now to support the decarbonation of the transport sector in the country. Can go on the next slide. So the global macro roadmap is quite an interesting approach, which has been created by the PPMC, which is the Paris Process on Mobility and Climate, following the Paris Agreement in order to decarbonize the transport sector to achieve net zero emission by 2050. You can go on the next slide. But this approach needed to be adapted to local perspectives and realities. So through the Sustainable Mobility Coalition of Climate Change, the roadmap for sustainable mobility has been replicated in Morocco, first in 2017, and then in Côte d'Ivoire. You can go on the next slide. So originally, the PPMC method So the global roadmap originally focused on 8 axes or trends of mobility, which helped us to build our own specific roadmap to address local needs and issues. You can go on the next slide. It started in 2018 during the Climate Change Summit in Abidjan, where a certain number of actors chose to initiate this process. And one of the possibility that we had, you can go on the next slide, sorry, with this process was to quantify the gain in greenhouse gases emission thanks to modelization with the training from the Institute of Sustainable Development and International Relations through the Deep Decarbonation Pathways project. So to give you a little bit of context, for those who don't know the Ivory transport sector, just know that in Côte d'Ivoire, like in most cities and countries in Africa, the sector is dominated by road and the informal sector as well. And when it comes to urban mobility, Abidjan was the only city to have a public transport system operated with buses and water buses. But this system only represents less than 20% of the modal share. And the major part of the transit is ensured by artisanal transport or informal transport. Which is composed of old, polluting minibuses. You also have artisanal boats, share taxis, meter taxis. And you also have, you also can find in secondary cities, 2 and 3 wheelers. So which makes this, finally the system is not sustainable because you kind of have two systems instead of one. And these 2 systems are not integrated. Especially, you can go on the next slide, especially with the major mass transit projects that are ongoing in the capital city of Abidjan, for example, like the light rail or the bus rapid transit, as well as the national road safety campaign and the video verbalization system, which will definitely change the face of mobility for the next 20 years. We needed to integrate this project sustainably through a sustainability mobility strategy. So that's why the roadmap for sustainable mobility aims to, you can go on the next slide, aims to create an orientation framework and also create a shared vision between different type of actors. There could be private, public, and mostly non-state actors, but also, always working alongside the Ministry of Transport and local authorities. This process also aims to facilitate the access of funding thanks to better visibility and legitimacy. So to build this roadmap, we have followed several steps. You can go on the next slide. Several steps to create this roadmap and include multiple stakeholders along the way. So we first proceeded with the identification of the stakeholders and made a diagnosis of mobility in Côte d'Ivoire. And then we proceeded to the construction of the actual roadmap with its main axis. So as I mentioned earlier, the PPMC tool focuses on 8 axes, but we realized, and when I say we, I include myself with all the mobility stakeholders in Côte d'Ivoire, we realized that we needed 2 more axes to focus on, which are the road safety and the education of users. So after building this, we had to refine and bring a sense of ownership to this roadmap outside the capital city. And we have led workshops on 3 different cities to actually have their inputs of municipalities, because we know that the realities are not the same in the capital city and in secondary cities. And the next step, actually, the last step in which we are in actually at the moment, is to quantify the targets and link the roadmap to the NDCs of the nation. And you can go on the next slide. And because this panel is all about showing how we can enhance resilience and raising community voices in our cities, the Roadmap for Sustainable Mobility allowed us to implicate the authorities, so which is represented by the Ministry of Transport, the Ministry of the Environment, and also the Urban Mobility Authority of Abidjan, but also to create an inclusive framework because we allowed a different type of actors to exchange ideas and give their input to improve the final document. Yet, this process doesn't allow us to go further into experimentation and implementation of projects, but it gives strong recommendations to do so. You can go on the next slide. So from experience, these are the 3 key points to take into account to implement projects effectively and improve people's living conditions. And I tried to gather here the main lessons and feedback that we had on this process. And we all agree that it is a beneficial process that must be supported and monitored by local authorities alongside with mobility stakeholders and users. It is also a golden mine for decision makers as a solid base to build a sustainable mobility strategy, because it focuses on the main characteristics of mobility. And we also acknowledge that we have to go beyond that because the roadmap should be focusing on experimentation as well, on pilot projects and also allocation for funding. And I would say that the next steps for this roadmap would be to be officially adopted by the Ministry of Transport, especially within local authorities. And it also should involve more ministries, like the Ministry of the Energy, for example, or communication, or even the environment, to go even further on the approach. It should also be relevant to applicate this roadmap on even more local level, so in secondary cities, for example.
If you could begin to wrap up, Charlene, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, exactly. It's the last sentence. Sorry. And the next step also would be to replicate this process in other African countries according to their own objectives and specific needs. And it's actually the case with Senegal that chose to follow this approach. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Charlene. There was a question for Shoaib, but I'm going to take it as for all of the panelists, if we get enough time, which is how do we make sure, given the call for new financial systems to address climate change, that they don't reproduce the sorts of environmental externalities we've seen from financial systems existing so far. I'll take that as a question to everybody if we get time at the end, because we need to move on. We bring full circle back to Colombia, where we started, from the mayor of Itagüí, with 2 contributions in this final panel. The first from Nidia Rueda from DIMU Women's Group in Itagüí, and the second from Juan Pablo Ortega, a peak urban researcher. Nidia is a representative of DIMU, the women's group in Itagüí, who are local entrepreneurial women who took part in a co-production of one of the projects on the Peak Urban program, a project aimed at encouraging people-centered local development. And the women's group were involved in actually designing the research, feeding back on the research and engaging in the way it was translated into practical actions. So we'll start off with a short film from colleagues at DIMU, please.
Mi nombre es Nidia Emir Ruda Aguirre, vivo en la vereda Los Gómez del corregimiento El Manzanillo de Itagüí. Pertenezco al grupo DIMU. El grupo DIMU es un diálogo de mujeres con unos objetivos en común, y es hablar del cambio climático, de la movilidad, de nuestra calidad del aire que respiramos acá en la ciudad de Itagüí y en el corregimiento. Cuando hay mucho invierno, lo que sucede mucho acá en el corregimiento son movimientos en masa, desbordamientos de quebradas, avenidas torrenciales, inundaciones. Lo que normalmente hace la comunidad es que empieza pues como a decirle al municipio pues que mire que se están inundando, pues ya el municipio está interviniendo algunas fuentes hídricas pues para hacerle gestión del riesgo, y está interviniendo las fuentes hídricas. La comunidad, ¿cómo puede buscar soluciones? Creo que es más de pensamiento ambiental, de cuidar nuestras fuentes hídricas, de trabajar para que las comunidades en los territorios cuiden pues como los retiros de las quebradas, no les arrojen residuos sólidos en ellas. El cambio climático se debe porque nosotros las personas hacemos, actuamos o tomamos ciertas costumbres o ciertos comportamientos sobre el medio ambiente que no se debe. Las emisiones de gases, eso también produce el efecto invernadero. Ante esas situaciones de crisis, pensaría yo que debemos de tener mucha conciencia para tener pensamiento ambiental y poder pues cuidar para nuestras futuras generaciones. Nosotros ya vamos de salida, dejarles de pronto una tierra donde puedan vivir mejor, una calidad de vida mejor, un ambiente mejor.
Many thanks. And now we come on finally to my colleague Juan Pablo Ortega. JP, as we all know him, has been working in the Oxford program in Peak Urban, based in the Columbia leg of our work. His work has been addressing issues at the interface of transport systems, health, access to health, and the interplay of those two systems. He previously worked in Washington, in the Clean Air Institute, where he was actually working on a number of programs relating to forms of transport that might reduce carbon footprint and impact on climate. But he's going to talk today about the co-production of the project in Itagüí we just heard introduced. JP.
Thank you, Michael. Can you hear me? Yes. So I think I have a presentation, if we can put the slides. Thank you. Good evening. My name is Juan Pablo Orjuela, as Michael just said. I'm a Senior Research Associate and Executive Education Program Director at the University of Oxford, the Transport Studies Unit. I've been doing research as part of PEAK for a little over 2 years now, and I've been working with a group of 40 women, one of which you just heard, Nidia Ruda, in the city of Itagüí in Colombia. We've also heard from the mayor of Itagüí, giving you a quick overview of the city's main challenges and plans related to climate change. And in the next few minutes, I'll be sharing briefly what we've been doing in Itagüí to strengthen the K component of PEAK, the knowledge exchange. Next slide, please. I'll start by saying why I think knowledge exchange is important in the context of climate change research and policy planning and resilient urban planning. I'll go into the how we approach knowledge exchange methodologies in PEAK. And finally, I'd like to end with a few words on what we use this knowledge exchange for, and to at least partially answer some of these questions. Next, please. I will use 3 boundaries, or these divisions, that will help illustrate my point. It will be the distinction between visibility and invisibility, between formality and informality, and between equity and inequity. Next slide, please. So let's begin with the why. Why do we believe that knowledge exchange is important for climate change research and resilient urban planning? There are, of course, many reasons, but the one that I want to highlight now is the power that it has in bridging the gap between the visible, could be university experts or governments, and the invisible, community leaders or sometimes even local authorities. Today, it is common that policymaking includes consultation processes, but these tend to be superficial. Knowledge exchange requires a purposeful approach to give visibility to people who have been invisible to traditional engagement approaches. For example, women in Colombia and in most of the majority world have disproportionate allocation of care responsibilities and thus are systematically excluded from participation spaces as they cannot afford to spend a morning discussing plans and programs, for example. They have access to lower wages, work more hours, are given less mobility options. If we want to listen to their voices, we need to develop methodologies that overcome some of these obstacles. Next slide, please. In our workshops, for example, we provide childcare. We recognize their time and investment through cash incentives, and we provide transport options to get to the venue and back. Next slide, please. Another reason why we want to listen to these voices is to make visible the impacts of climate change on those who will be hit the hardest. It is people like Nidia that will be disproportionately affected by floods and droughts. They will suffer the consequences of increased frequency of extreme weather events brought by climate change with much more intensity and with much more serious consequences. Like these pictures that Nidia sent me last year show when mudslides destroy some of the houses in the area. 2 neighbors lost their lives under the rubble. Why is knowledge exchange relevant then? Because it makes visible the impacts of climate change traditional methods have left in the margins. You've heard from the mayor talk about the Doña Maria Creek, for it's famous in the area. But when the rainy season comes, people in higher up in the mountains already know that floods are coming. This knowledge exchange can be useful, but only if we learn to listen. Next, please. So how do we do this in peak? It is not only through workshops, but through various kinds of tools for knowledge exchange that begin by recognizing local communities as local experts and not just as individuals who must be made aware of the risks. We communicate via WhatsApp. They send us photos of their access to food, some poems on their mental health, their experiences with COVID. We co-create knowledge exchange spaces making use of wide variety of tools, and they choose which one is the one that suits them best. This empirical knowledge needs to be recognized by policymakers and researchers as valuable and formal as knowledge from engineers and government officials, for example. Next slide, please. Local communities' voices can be recognized as valuable and legitimate evidence and not dismissed as informal anecdotes. Because in a similar way as they share taxis in peri-urban Itagüí on the left here, the chiveros, and they are dismissed versus the bus on the right as being too informal, and their homes are not rebuilt when mudslides come because they are part of settlements that are not recognized by land use plans, so are their voices often ignored with the excuse of being anecdotal. But it is that so-called informal transport, the one that offers flexible routes, and those homes that are off the grid, some of the ones that can be used for photovoltaic pilots, for example, and those voices, the ones that offer deep knowledge of the territory. Next slide, please. So what is this all for? You heard Nidia saying that she is willing to reduce her emissions, but according to our data, for example, the women in our territory are walking 50% of their trips, and none of them own a car. As individuals, their actions have very limited impacts despite wanting to do their part to fight climate change. Next slide, please. However, it is their collective voices that can help make better policy decisions with important consequences for them. Using the data from virtual workshops we had during the 2020 lockdowns, and by establishing an open dialogue with local authorities, 5 articles of the mayor's development plan were changed to include things like better walking infrastructure in their territory, adequate solid waste disposal containers, and the recognition of environmental leaders as generators of positive change. Although some of these points were mentioned in the original plan, the lack of explicit recognition of their knowledge exchange exercises needed to promote, replicated, reinforced, and enhanced to create the positive impact that climate change policy desperately needs. Next slide, and last one. In PEAK, we are emphasizing knowledge exchange as one of our research priorities for resilient cities because it allows us to make visible what current economic and social systems have made invisible. We're doing this by recognizing the importance of knowledge that has traditionally been dismissed as informal, and we are doing it so we can bridge some of the inequities that climate change will enhance. Today, I brought the case study of Itagüí in Colombia, but these arguments apply to communities and territories around the world. Official policy discourse on climate change around the globe has not been effective in making these voices visible and recognize them as legitimate. Our experience shows that knowledge exchange is a powerful tool to build resilient and equitable communities, but it needs explicit support from researchers and decision makers. That's my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to move swiftly to at least try and get some questions. So if I can just alert our last four speakers, and Shoaib and Robin, one question for you, and that is the one that Karen Benny asked about how we try and create new financial models without generating environmental externalities of the past. And as a heads up to our last two speakers, to Charlene and JP, the question is, how do we balance those formal transport systems with informal innovations, which combines a few questions we've been asked online. But if people can keep themselves very unfairly just to one sentence, otherwise we just get cut off in the time we have available. So maybe a slightly long sentence, but first of all, Robin, could you maybe come back with a single sentence answer, please, to that? If you
sure. That the financial models that we need to incorporate those externalities need to be used by anybody that has anything to do with the decision-making process, whether that's a budget official, a government policymaker, an investor, or a financial regulator that's going to be looking at what those assets are going to be like on the balance sheets.
Thank you.
Of the financial institutions.
Thank you. Shoaib.
Yeah, for the financial models that we're talking about here, there has to be a change in the due diligence process as well as risk assessment, which means that the return to investment has to be redefined. There is a moral obligation from all of us to actually invest in less risky infrastructure with less environmental externalities. And on the other side, that will allow the businesses to imagine on the other side guiding principles and flexible or adaptive regulation to enable the ingenuities of different groups that I imagine. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that tight answer as well. And if we move on to the final two presentations, first of all, Charlene, if you're still there to yourself, could you also comment on these few questions that we're being asked about the balance between the formal transport systems and informal transport systems that we see in work?
Mm-hmm. First of all, I would say that our local authorities and governments have to understand that the informal transport is the core of transport and transit nowadays in Africa and in a lot of emerging countries as well. And that big investment should be also allocated to them, and not only on mass transportation project, because this is the real problem nowadays in Africa, is that we have big mass transportation projects that are taking a lot of investment and take a lot of time also to be implemented, while there is a system that is actually functioning, but that needs to be understood, that needs to be regulated. So I think that the balance will be maintained, or at least found, if we actually put forward the need of the people. And most people in African cities use paratransit transport to move around the city every day. So I hope I answered the question.
Thank you very much. And JP?
Yeah, I agree completely with that answer. I think that with those informal, so-called informal parts, we, instead of trying to figure out how to incorporate them into a system, we need to empower them and let the system find its own route, I guess.
I totally agree.
Thank you, JP. Thank you, all of the contributors today. We need to wrap up in the next couple of minutes. So just to recap and tie up the session. The session which actually we started off signaling the importance of community voices shaping infrastructure and resilience, and what we have tried to show, I think, through our work with various partners, with colleagues in WRI, with colleagues at Google, that we have a disposition, an approach, as Sue Parnell opened up at the very beginning of our presentation. There is a sense that there is power in the new urban sciences, in the data analytics that are possible using new sources of information in actually making cities visible. But that source of information, the P of prediction, only becomes particularly relevant when we understand the dynamics of complex systems of cities, how systems meet with other systems, how they generate that novelty that we explored as forms of emergence in the examples we saw that related to both sanitation and to ways of addressing and allowing and empowering community voices when thinking about slum upgrading in particular places, which ties into that sense of adopting particular kinds of practices that we heard from in on those last two panels. That sense that technology is one kind of practice that changes cities, but it is also only one way in which new forms of adopted practice begin to change the interfaces of different city systems. Led us into that final section of our presentations today, the K of the PEAK of our acronym that shaped our presentation today. The K that is about knowledge exchange, that actually valorizes the work that goes on in the laboratory, in the ivory tower, alongside the practices in City Hall, but also recognizes the power of local voices, the power of the third sector, the power of NGOs on the ground, the power of intermediaries at working above national level, as well as links between central and local government. That networked form of knowledge actually makes visible that the power of knowledge exchange working through multiple networks. In that context, that hopefully sets up the understanding that's run through the presentation today about why it is important to think about community voices in shaping infrastructure and resilience. And thank you for joining online today. And hopefully you will take away from that those fantastic examples that we, again, thank our colleagues for presenting. Good evening. And